Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 North Shore Early Childhood Conference to Learn to Wonder. We begin tonight's presentation with a land acknowledgement, and I invite you to write in the chat box to let us know where you're zooming in from. I am speaking from the unceded traditional ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Shishalt, and Lil'wat nations, whose people called these lands home long before the arrival of settlers, and for many of these Indigenous peoples, it is still home. My name is Violet Jessen, and I am a member of the North Shore Early Childhood Conference Committee, a faculty in the Early Childhood Care and Education program at Capilano University, current chair of the Early Childhood Educators of BC, and an early childhood educator for nearly 25 years. I was born in Vancouver, and I'm the daughter of Asian immigrants. My Chinese name is Xu Waiman. Xu is my family name. Wai means clever, and Man means quick. My father is Xu Yingheng, and my mother is Ng Bickwin. And they escaped from an oppressive government in mainland China, and via Hong Kong arrived separately in Canada in the late 1950s. I entered a school system where history lessons minimized or ignored the violence and cruelties that were dealt to the Indigenous peoples of Canada. Colonial practices and laws and the establishment of residential schools by the governments of the day attempted to suppress and crush them, but they have survived and shown their resilience. It is because of the legacies of residential schools and an oppressive system that non-Indigenous people have benefited from being on these lands. Land acknowledgements do not exist in past tense nor historical context. The impact of colonialism is a reality, and we must and should build our mindfulness of our present participation. Individually and together, we need to scrutinize systems that continue to perpetuate outrageous injustices. This scrutiny will make us uncomfortable and unsettled. However, the Truth and Reconciliation Report and the calls to action compels us to act. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights for Indigenous Peoples compels us to act. The First Peoples Principles of Learning that is written in the BC Early Learning Framework compels us to act. As early childhood educators, we can begin by talking less, listening more, taking action, and taking responsibility for our decision-making and responding in ways that honor the original stewards of this land. I'd like to thank the conference committee members who commit year in and year out to this wonderful conference. We are and always will be a collection of local North Shore organizations and associations committed to creating exciting professional development events for the early childhood community. These organizations are the ECBC North Shore Branch, Lifeways Child Care Society, North Shore Community Resources Society, North Shore Supported Child Development Program, North Shore Neighborhood House, Strong Start at the Boundary Elementary School, Vancouver Coastal Health North Shore, and the Capilano University Children's Center. I would like to say a special thank you to Emily Golick and Sonia Tavares from ECEBC, the provincial office. ECBC has generously provided the Zoom webinar platform and technology so that we can host such a large number of delegates. If you are requiring a professional development certificate, you do have to attend both seminars tonight and tomorrow's webinar, which is tomorrow at 10 a.m. Vancouver time, Living Inquiries, Thinking with the BC Early Learning Framework. We have an amazing keynote presentation tonight being given by Dr. Affrica Taylor, Dr. Mindy Blaise, and Dr. Veronica Pacini-Ketchabaw of the Common Worlds Research Collective. We also have with us tonight Dr. Kathleen Kummen, who has so graciously accepted to be the moderator for this evening. Dr. Kathleen Kummen is a co-director of the Early Childhood Pedagogy Network and the chair of the School of Education and Childhood Studies at Capilano University, located on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples. As a researcher, educator, and instructor, Kathleen endeavors to reimagine and revitalize early childhood leadership as an ongoing practice of disruption to make space for alternative narratives of early childhood education. I've been teaching alongside Kathleen for many years, and I'm very fortunate and proud to be a colleague of Dr. Kummen. She has been instrumental in shaping the ECCE program at Capilano University, and she continues to influence and inspire our faculty and our students. Take it away, Kathleen.
Thank you very much, Violet, for your kind words. As Violet says, my name is Kathleen Kummen, and I am joining you today from Treaty 2 territory, the traditional lands and ancestral home of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, and Dakota nations. Treaty 2 is also the historic homeland of many Métis people. I offer up this land acknowledgement to express my deep gratitude as an uninvited guest on these lands, and to honor the ancestral and current keepers of the lands. I know that in offering up this land acknowledgement, I am in no way erasing the legacy of colonization and my own implication in ongoing acts of colonization. However, it is my hope that as we all, those of us living in the nation state now known as Canada, respond to the recent throne speech announcing a commitment to a national accessible early years program, will work in ways to create spaces that children deserve, but also work to honor Indigenous governance so that they can provide the education that their children so greatly deserve. It is my great honor to introduce our keynote speakers, as Violet said, and the founding members of the Common World Research Collective, Doctors Affrica Taylor, Mindy Blaise, and Veronica Pacini-Ketchabaw. These scholars, my colleagues and friends, have taught me more than I could share with you tonight. Whether it is sitting in a lecture hall, enthralled and inspired by their words, or sitting laughing around a kitchen table, engaged in a radical dialogue with them, in which I'm actually more of a listener than a participant. Individually and collectively, they have challenged me to think what it means to be a feminist scholar, to work in collaborative ways, not to achieve consensus, but to labor for transformative change. I've learned from them and with them what it means to work with ethical commitments, which often can mean taking the more difficult path. They continue to challenge me to think deeply, to strive to live with humility and generosity. In their collective biography on the Common World's Research Collective site, Affrica, Mindy, and Veronica state that they share a commitment to exposing and challenging education's complicity with modernity's larger project of colonizing minds, people, and lands. They experiment with practical ways of articulating feminist, more than human common world ethics into grounded modes of collaborative learning with the world, not only just about it. Their goal is to enhance the possibilities for recuperative and inclusive cohabitation on a damaged planet. Dr. Mindy Blaise is a Vice Chancellor Professional Research Fellow at Edith Cowan University in Western Australia. Her background in the early years, interest in feminist and post theories, and her identity as a white settler, cis-queer woman influences how she approaches her research. Her interdisciplinary and post-developmental research with the more than human uses emergent, affect-focused, and creative methods to rework a humanist ontology. She is interested in how the more than human and feminist speculative research practices activate new meanings about childhood that sit outside the narrow confines of developmentalism. Affrica Taylor is an adjunct associate professor in the Center for Creative and Cultural Studies at the University of Canberra, and also a great knitter. Her abiding interest in the entangled relations between people, places, and other species was sparked while working as an educator in remote and urban Aboriginal communities in the 1980s and 90s, and consolidated in her doctoral research, a settler colonial geography of place and belonging. Her current work is situated within the feminist environmental humanities, experiments with collective, more than human, and creative modes of thinking and writing, and is geared towards redressing the entangled social and environmental legacies of colonization and capitalistic excesses. She is motivated by a commitment to find recuperative and convivial ways of co-inhabiting damaged common worlds in ecologically challenged times. And finally, last but not least, Veronica Pacini-Ketchabaw is a full professor in early childhood education at Western University in London, Ontario. Her academic background in early childhood education and her current work as a pedagogist are combined with insights from feminist theory, environmental humanities, Indigenous studies, and cultural geography. Her interdisciplinary research with educators and young children explores the possibilities of common world pedagogies. It strives to engage children to pay close attention to place, to other species, and to how we all got to be in the space we share. She is interested in how we might learn with other species in the colonial spaces we co-inhabit. Welcome. Before we begin, I'd just like to invite all of our participants, and I look down and see that we're almost at 300, that if you have questions, to please put them in the chat. Violet and I will be curating the questions throughout the presentation, and we will leave ample time to be able to go back and to answer them. Welcome, Mindy, Veronica, and Affrica. I'm so glad to be here with you. I wonder if you could begin by sharing how the Common Worlds Research Collective came into being. What were your intentions and your values and your desires that fueled this amazing pedagogical and research project?
Well, I don't think it happened overnight. It sort of, it unfolded, it emerged. I'm not originally from early childhood education. I started doing research in early childhood education around 2005 when I got a job in an education faculty. I'd come from cultural geography before and Indigenous cultural studies, so I'd been working in those fields for years. And when I started thinking about a conceptual framework for early childhood pedagogies, I was really interested in the notion of common worlds because I'd read a lot of Latour's work, and it's actually Bruno Latour's term. So he started using that term in the 80s, I think, and kept using it through the 90s. He still uses it occasionally. But I think I sort of grabbed onto it because it really spoke to me about, in a couple of ways, First off, I really love the idea of the commons. And I think about that, not just in terms of human commons, but in terms of, the ways that the notion of the commons is used in the sciences, the sky, the air we breathe, the water, everything about the world and we live in is something, that's common to all beings on earth. So the notion of commons, I really loved, and the notion of worlds and worlding, particularly, through my readings of Donna Haraway, was also really attractive to me. I sort of love the idea that we live in a world, we don't just live in a society. And I thought that the notion of common worlds, or a more kind of agentic notion of common worlding or commoning the world, very active kind of notion, was kind of desperately needed in early childhood education, because for me, it seemed so limited by its sort of sociocultural frameworks. So I was a bit kind of shocked, because I'd come out of working with Indigenous people for a couple of decades, and because I'm a cultural geographer and we kind of straddle the sort of physical, so-called natural world and the social or cultural worlds, I was kind of shocked that to imagine that anyone could think that children only learn from a sort of sociocultural context. I thought, well, it's kind of obvious they learn in a world, the whole world, not just the human one. So really that's sort of where the idea of it came from. And I threw it around quite a bit with quite a few colleagues about a decade ago. And then it just started to take off when the three of us got together. And I think we were trying to work out when we actually first started collaborating. And I think it was, we'd known each other for a while and known each other's work for a while, but there was a RISI conference in London in the UK, 2011. And Mindy and I had already written a paper using Donna Haraway's work on multi-species sort of relations, and we were looking at children's pedagogical relations with animals. And we'd written this paper already, and we were presenting on it in the conference. And Veronica was invited to be the discussant. And Veronica really got into reading up on Donna Haraway's work too. I think we were at the time reading her When Species Meet book. And so we all kind of connected, I think, very much connected around the ideas that that Donna Haraway was talking about, bringing them into early childhood in ways that we found very exciting. But I sort of suspect that other people in early childhood at the time found particularly weird and didn't really get it. So that sort of bonded us, actually, the fact that we felt as if we were on this page together, but it felt a bit like nobody else was there with us.
And I think it's kind of important, Kathleen, you said, how did it come about? And I do think it really started to solidify at that Reconceptualizing conference in London. But I think that we've had relationships before that. And so, I was new to Australia. I moved to Australia in 2000s, and Affrica and I met each other because of our interest in queer theory. And one of the things that I always tell emerging scholars and postgrad students is that you need to find your people, and you need to find your people quick, because you need to figure out who you're going to be in this game with for the long haul. And so Affrica and I figured that out really quickly. And then I knew of Veronica's work. And in fact, I don't know if you remember this, Veronica, but I think I was a co-chair of AERA, of the Critical SIG, and I was a program chair for AERA one year, and I put together the panels. And I remember that you were on a panel that I had put together, but I don't know if we really got to know each other at that conference, but I knew of your work. And I want to say we might have even had an email exchange or something because of that conference, but my memory is pretty bad. But I do have a recollection that the three of us got to know each other at a Reconceptualizing conference in New Zealand. Do you remember that?
I do remember that, yes.
What do you remember about that?
I remember it being one of the big RISI conferences, and indigenous knowledges were kind of introduced to the entire early childhood education, post-structural scholars. And I think there's a big shock about
Yeah.
that. And yes. And then Mindy, we went to the same lake dinner.
We did.
Yes.
We did. It was at Wendy Lee's batch.
That's
what
right.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And you were there too, Affrica. I think we rode in the. Yeah. Anyways, but but I guess for me, I mean, I think that long-standing relationship is really important, and that we've been colleagues and friends for a very long time. And the Common Worlds Collective, at the very, very beginning, it was really a way for us to support each other. You know, I come back to this idea of how are we going to thrive in this neoliberal, highly competitive, individualized sort of workforce or work world that we're in universities. And these were, for me, Affrica and Veronica are two like-minded spirits, in that we knew that it wasn't about doing academia alone, that it was about doing it together. So, you know, the Common Worlds Collective was a way of finding, supporting ourselves, but also then growing our people, if you will. And it's always has that feminist, more than human values. So that's something that has grounded us. And it did happen, though, with that RISI conference, something then, that's when we started to become much more intentional. And I would even say strategic about what we wanted to do, why we needed to do it. And for me, it was about really doing academia otherwise, because there have to be better ways, and I want to enjoy my work, and I don't want to always have to feel like the imposter, and I don't always want to feel like I'm never good enough. You know, with this collective, I feel like I'm in good company.
I'll just also add that what's also important for us is that to create a space for other scholars to come in, and that certainly, yes, we are very present within the Common Worlds Collective, and yet at the same time, it's not just about us, right? There are colleagues like you, Kathleen, who has been always thinking within these ideas, and a lot of our colleagues at Capilano University and a lot of graduate students, who always help to rethink the intentions, the values, and the desires that are always in the process of being developed within the Common Worlds Research Collective. And, you know, just to give you an example, like thinking how Figile brings in feminist Black studies to think in connection with Common Worlds collectives, and Christina will bring in the pedagogical work to think with Common Worlds collective. So there are always these intersections, and always this bringing in more people to think together with us. And I think I very much value that. And I also want to add that in terms of your question, Kathleen, about intentions, one of the intentions was to think about, or to think outside child development. Child development has been dominating early childhood education for so long, and how might we think early childhood education differently?
And I think kind of taking this in a not in a different way, but it comes back to part of those intentions and values and desires. They were really fueled not only to challenge developmentalism, but it was about feminism and feminist philosophy, and how does that help do that too. And so that was really, and still is really, really vital and important. So I think that's something that certainly links the three of us together and lots of other people in the common worlds. And I guess going back to setting up the collective and building this collective, for me, it was while I was reading Donna Haraway, and I remember reading this together with Affrica and Miriam. We actually read Donna Haraway together and out loud. But while I was reading that, I started to notice how she cited and how she made reference to all of like this huge network that she has. And so she was teaching me how you do citational politics. And so I think there's this practice of living your citational politics that's related to one of the ways that we do the collective, that it is, yeah, that these stories that we're making and that we're generating together, and the research that we're making and generating together has never been done alone, that it's always with others. So that's something that was really influential for me about the collective.
I might just go back to the notion of common worlds again, because the reason, I mean, I'm totally with Mindy and Veronica about the feminist sort of principles and ways of doing work together and thinking together being incredibly important, and the fact that it's ongoing. And when Veronica was talking about how there's no kind of fixed, there's no sort of set down creed, it's kind of constantly being challenged, emerging, shifting. And that is what I'd think of as commoning. It's, you know, there's always this bringing in, and it's just, and it never stays still. It isn't sort of anything you can sort of slam down and say, this is it. And there's a set of kind of principles and rules to work by. But having said that, what was really attractive for me about the notion of common worlds is it was a way of not having to say nature. So this is a very specific thing to me because of my geography background. And because of all my years of working with Aboriginal people in Australia, like nobody uses the word nature in Aboriginal, you know, kind of parlance. You know, people say country. I think it's sort of the equivalent of land, perhaps in Canada. But you know, country actually means all sorts of really complex, layered things. It means kinship. It means obligation. It means life, it means growing up, it means survival, it means ancestry, it means all sorts of stuff. And nature's just not a word that you know is all that common. It's a very Western concept, and it's a very way that it's come into early childhood education. It's come through a very kind of romantic route via Rousseau. I've sort of wrote about this a lot in the book that I wrote about reconfiguring the natures of childhood. So I've been obsessed all this time of kind of picking up on the kind of romance of nature that just gets trolled out all the time and sort of seen as almost a sort of moral high ground, and something that sort of represents everything good, and that therefore needs to be kind of coupled with children because they're so good and pure and innocent like nature is. So that kind of coupling of a certain sort of romantic notion of nature and childhood was something that really confronted me when I came into this field as a researcher. And I thought, no, this isn't right. This is like a very white, middle class, privileged kind of Western way of thinking about nature. Like it just, it needs to be challenged. So really common worlds for me was a way of not saying nature. It was a way of bypassing it. And in Donna Haraway's terms, it's a way of talking about natures and cultures together. So she uses the word nature's cultures or nature culture. Latour uses the word common worlds. We've sort of gone with common worlds, but I think, you know, that it's the same thing. It's saying that it's indivisible. What we in the West think about as nature as opposed to culture via a kind of a Descartesian structured philosophical tradition that separates us from the rest of the world. is, you know, is in fact a fantasy. And we're just, you know, changing our language is a way of changing the way we think about stuff. So for me, the whole idea of commonwealths was actually a substitute for thinking about nature and culture separately. We'll probably get back to this because it's a big sort of topic to pick up on again, I think.